Damn all those fake people to hell. I've kept quiet for far too long. I'm Clara, the bride who walked away from her wedding, not with a stain on her dress, but with a deep crack in her heart and a truth more painful than the stumble down the flower-strewn aisle. That day, it wasn't the gown that got dirty. It was a mask that finally fell off. At my own wedding, I heard my father scoff, "She's lucky he even showed up." I stood up, not in tears, not running away, but turned around and faced them, right there in front of every guest. Do you think I should have stayed silent, or did exactly what I did? If you were in my shoes, would you swallow your pride or stand up for yourself? Drop a comment and tell me if you've ever faced something like this. And don't look away, because the next part of this story will leave you breathless. I woke up at 5:32 a.m., and just as the first light began to slide through the sheer curtains. The hotel room where my bridesmaids and I had stayed the night before was still quiet, but my heart was already beating to a different rhythm, faster, tighter, and completely out of control. Today was my wedding day, the day the little girl who once stood in front of the mirror practicing, "Mom, do I look pretty?" finally wore a real white dress, the day I officially became a wife. I sat up, gently slipping my hand from under the blanket, careful not to wake my best friend Jenna. She was curled up like a cat, breathing softly at the corner of the bed. As my feet touched the soft carpet, the chill made me realize I was trembling. Not from the cold, but from something else. Was it joy, anticipation, or anxiety? I looked at myself in the tall mirror hanging by the window. A 29-year-old woman stared back, soft curls falling loosely, faint shadows under tired eyes. But those eyes? They felt unfamiliar. I saw myself, yet I also saw someone else. A Clara who had lived through thousands of hours of silence, who had learned to try just hard enough not to disappoint anyone, who had mastered the art of smiling through dinners where no one called her name. I placed my hand over my heart. The beat was so strong it felt like it was knocking at my own soul, Ethan. He was still asleep in the hotel across the street, where the tradition of not seeing each other before the wedding was being strictly followed. Was he thinking about me the way I was thinking about him? Did he know I was trembling, not because I doubted us, but because I wasn't sure how others would treat me on this supposedly special day? A soft knock on the door. Jenna, groggy but ever attentive, got up to answer it. 2 makeup artists walked in, cheerful and scented with a hint of perfume, carrying shiny toolboxes. I slipped into a white silk robe and sat by the window. Sunlight was now spilling into the room. As one of the artists shaped my brows, she asked, "Feeling nervous, bride-to-be?" I smiled, a smile borrowed from a movie scene. A little, but it's a good kind of nervous. Good? Or was I just masking the undercurrent building inside me? I wasn't afraid of marriage. Ethan was the one thing in this world that made me believe in choices. What I feared were the looks, the whispered comments, the indifferent nods. I feared my father's eyes, or rather, the absence within them. And I feared her, Diana. Diana, the woman my father married just a year after my mother passed. The woman who always called me the strong one when speaking about me to others, but never once asked if I was truly okay. The woman who praised my home decor as so unique, only to quietly tell her friend it was a little tasteless. I grew up in that house, where my mother's voice vanished and Diana's grew louder. I learned to live quietly, politely, without causing trouble. I told myself, one day they'll see me. But they never did. "The stepmother of the bride is here," a voice called up from the lobby. I froze. The makeup artist's hand stopped mid-stroke as she lined my eyes. I exhaled, softly, not to keep my foundation intact, but because I didn't want anyone to see me afraid. The sharp click of heels echoed with every step. The door creaked open. Diana entered like someone born for the spotlight. Her blonde hair pinned up high, her champagne-colored dress, almost white, hugged her figure, and a faint scent of Chanel No. 5 trailed behind her. She smiled, a smile just warm enough not to be called cold, but never warm enough to be comforting. "Clara, you look lovely this morning. But remember, don't cry too much. Waterproof mascara has its limits. No, I'm proud of you. No, you've grown into a beautiful woman." Just another veiled warning, as always. I nodded softly. "Thank you, ma'am." Ma'am? Not Mom. I didn't expect her to change. I just wished, for once, she wouldn't make me feel like I was borrowing the role of the bride in my own story. My father arrived not long after. He wore a navy blue suit, tie perfectly knotted. He looked at me for exactly 3 seconds, then said, "You look fine." I pressed my lips together. Fine? I was getting married. I was standing at the most important crossroads of my life, and all he had for me was a word that hung in the air, shapeless and emotionless. I smiled faintly. "I think so too." My heart sank. Was I wrong to hope for more? Was it my fault for always wishing that one day he'd truly see me, not as the daughter of the woman he lost, not as a leftover from his old life, but as me? Outside the window, the wedding arch was being finalized. White lace ribbons fluttered in the golden light. Far across the lawn, I spotted Ethan adjusting the decor with one of the staff, sleeves rolled up, that gentle smile on his face. My heart softened. Whatever happened today, I knew I had chosen right. Ethan wasn't perfect, but he never made me feel like I had to earn his love. I turned to the mirror, one last time before the ceremony. A girl in a white gown looked back at me, eyes holding something unspoken. Regret? Or a final shred of hope? I whispered to myself, "This day is mine, whether they see me or not." In the hallway, the MC's voice called for guests to take their seats. The wedding was about to begin, and in that golden morning light, I walked forward. Not with complete confidence, but with every ounce of courage I had. I didn't see Diana as I entered the aisle, but I felt her gaze, tightening around my shoulders like an invisible thread. Amid the soft piano music and fresh blooms arranged to perfection, something else lingered quietly, waiting to strike. The cold, suffocating elegance of that woman's presence. I walked into the ceremony to the sound of gentle piano keys, my arm trembling slightly beneath the sheer lace of my gown. Rows of guests stood before me, familiar and unfamiliar faces mingled together. Some smiled, some brought a hand to their chest in awe. But of all the eyes watching me, I only truly felt one pair. Not cold, not openly disdainful, but sharp enough to cut through me, to examine each step like a judge behind a mask. Diana. She sat in the front row on the left, legs crossed, her dress perfectly pressed, a silver watch on her wrist, the very same one she wore to my mother's funeral. Coincidence? Or quiet calculation? Her face showed no obvious expression, but I knew that look, the slight purse of her lips, the way her eyes trailed from the hem of my dress to the shoes I'd chosen. It wasn't admiration, it was assessment. I passed her without looking, without hesitating, but I could feel her shadow slinking behind every step I took on that white aisle. Ethan stood waiting at the end. He wore a charcoal tuxedo, crisp and composed down to every fold. The look in his eyes as he saw me, that was the only gaze I wanted to remember for the rest of my life. In it, I saw love, reverence, and a silent vow. "I see you." I inhaled deeply, trying to let everything else dissolve. But I couldn't, because Diana was still there, and so was my father, sitting beside her, his face as blank as always. No glimmer of emotion, no smile, just a dull look, as if he were attending a ceremony that had nothing to do with him. I felt small again, like the little girl who used to stand in the living room doorway, waiting for a good night that never came. He never opposed this marriage, but he never truly gave his blessing either. From the moment I told him I was marrying Ethan, he asked me just one thing. "Are you sure?" He didn't ask why I loved him, didn't ask how I felt when Ethan proposed, no real curiosity at all. And that question, though simple, felt like a pin driven into my palm every time I recalled it. I had grown used to his silence, but never to the feeling of being someone not worth asking about. The ceremony went smoothly, almost perfectly. The pastor smiled gently and spoke with a warm, measured voice. When it was Ethan's turn to read his vows, he choked slightly on the line. "You are the peace I never knew I needed until I found it in you." I squeezed his hand. No one in my family had ever said anything that beautiful to me. Then I spoke my vows, steady and composed, even surprising myself. No tears, no trembling, just truth, spoken while looking into the one pair of eyes that saw me fully. I told him that he was the first person who made me feel I didn't need to earn love to be loved. That he saw me in the truest, deepest way. Applause rang out after our first kiss as husband and wife. I should have felt complete joy, but a thought echoed through my mind. What is Diana thinking? Is she smirking behind that flawless facade? And worse yet, did my father feel anything at all? Did he see anything? We exited the ceremony to cheers and confetti. The midday sun bathed us in golden light, flowers tossed in the air like blessings. Ethan held my hand tightly. For the first time since walking into that room, I laughed. A soft, fleeting laugh of relief. But it faded quickly when I looked back. Diana didn't clap. She stood, adjusted her dress, and walked out as if she had just finished a boring afternoon tea. My father followed. He didn't take her hand. He didn't look back. And I finally understood. In their hearts, I was still a lingering piece of the past they didn't want to hold on to. The reception was held in the hotel's back garden, where strands of golden fairy lights glowed beneath the trees, and each table was set with scented candles and handwritten menus in brown ink. I had planned every detail myself, because if my love wasn't going to be respected, at least the space that held it could be beautiful. Guests began approaching to offer congratulations. Ethan leaned close and whispered in my ear, "They all say you're the most stunning bride they've ever seen." I smiled softly, but another thought tugged at me. And what about her? Diana sat at the head table. Her seat was beside my father's, as always, centered in the space, yet detached from all emotion. I saw her scanning the room, tilting her head with faint, unreadable smiles. A friend of mine passed by and whispered, "Your stepmother looks like a movie star, but kind of icy." I nodded. Icy was putting it kindly. I continued weaving through the celebration, toasts, laughter, clinking glasses, and soft waltz music. Yet all the while, I felt it. Diana's shadow at my back. She didn't scream, didn't object, but her presence was a slow-burning flame, constant and unyielding. As I stood near the cake table, waiting for the cutting ceremony, I turned just in time to see Diana lean toward Aunt Marlene and whisper something. I didn't hear it, but the slight curl of her lips sent a chill down my spine. What had she said? Another critique? A disguised jab? Or something crueler? I gripped my champagne glass tighter, sweat beading in my palm. I forced a smile at a guest approaching me, but in my head the same question returned, the one I'd asked myself for years. When will I ever truly be free of her shadow? There was no thunderclap, no uproar, just a conversation, quiet enough to go unnoticed by others, but loud enough to echo inside me forever. I was standing behind the head table, quietly admiring the soft glow of candles lining the cake stand. Gentle music played, guests chatted and laughed, and I, a bride only hours into marriage, was doing my best to cradle the fragile atmosphere like a trembling hand holding a delicate balloon. Then I heard her voice. Diana leaned toward Aunt Marlene, one of the last relatives from my mother's side, and spoke in a voice soft as velvet but sharp as a blade. "She's just acting like she's loved. It's all for show." Each word hit like a drop of acid on raw skin. I wasn't sure if I heard it right. I wished I hadn't, but I had. Clear as day, as if the world around me had hushed just to let that sentence ring inside my head, unfiltered. Before I could turn away, my father spoke, this time without even trying to hide his intent. He laughed, not a polite, hesitant chuckle, a real laugh, followed by a scoff and a shake of the head. "She's lucky the guy even showed up. He'll figure it out eventually." I froze. The glass in my hand trembled. I wasn't sure I was even breathing. My body felt strangled by something invisible. And right there, at my own wedding, I felt like a guest who didn't belong. I turned, unsteady on my feet like someone drunk. But it wasn't alcohol that made me dizzy. It was the truth. A truth I had tried not to face for years. They didn't love me. They didn't care. Not even enough to pretend. To them, I was just a background character, a girl clinging to something she'd never been allowed to call her own. I smiled at the approaching photographer, murmured that I needed air, and walked straight into the garden. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just stood there, hands clutched so tightly together they went white. The wind tossed the train of my wedding gown and the curled strands of hair loosened from a long afternoon. My mind was blank. What had I done wrong? Why, even on my wedding day, was I still not good enough in my father's eyes? Years of obedience, academic excellence, staying out of the way. Had it all been meaningless? I thought of the dinners with Diana, each of her comments a needle hidden in silk. I thought of the hand-me-downs from her daughter Lily, always accepted with a grateful smile. I thought of my father's silence, through school bullying, on my 18th birthday he forgot, and now, as he laughed at the biggest dream I ever dared to live. I used to believe time would change them, that family bonds could be mended with patience, but now I knew, not all cracks can be sealed. Some are fed by silence, and silence was the weapon they used to make me disappear from their world. I clenched the fabric of my dress and drew a long breath. I couldn't run. I wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I was the bride, the host, the woman who had just vowed forever to an incredible man. I had to go back, even if I was bleeding on the inside. I looked through the glass doors. Ethan was laughing with a few friends, completely unaware of what had just unfolded. And suddenly, my heart softened. Maybe the world wasn't on my side. But he was. I stepped back into the reception hall. No one noticed. I was still the radiant bride, makeup intact, still smiling, still nodding politely to every congratulation. But inside, something had shifted. I no longer hoped for my father's approval. I no longer feared Diana's whispers. I thought of one thing only. I am enough, whether they see it or not. Ethan caught my eye. He frowned slightly, reading my face. I smiled, just a little, and sat beside him. My hand rested on my glass, trying to hide the sweat pooling in my palm. But my heart still trembled with a single, unanswered question. How long do I have to keep pretending? The microphone crackled. The MC announced it was time for speeches. Scattered applause followed. A few people stood, one after another, sharing lighthearted stories. A friend of mine joked about how I skipped a work meeting to help her pick up her dog from the vet. A distant aunt recalled the time I gave up a scholarship to let someone else have a chance. People laughed, clinked glasses, toasted. But I didn't hear a thing. My eyes were fixed on the front table, where Diana sat like an unchallenged queen, and my father stared into his wine glass as though counting the last drops. I wondered, do they feel guilt? Do they know they've lost something? I didn't know. Maybe I never would. But I knew this much. They no longer get to dictate how I feel. And what I didn't expect was who stood up next. Ethan. He set his glass down. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word beforehand. I panicked, reaching for his hand, whispering, "What are you doing?" Ethan leaned down and kissed the top of my head. "Trust me." Then he walked toward the front, and the entire room began to fall silent, as if someone had unplugged the background noise of the world. The room wasn't completely silent, but the sounds that remained felt like a veil, thin, fragile, covering something about to break. Ethan stood at the microphone. He didn't raise his glass. He didn't bow his head. He didn't begin with the usual pleasantries. He simply stood there, hands clasped in front of him, eyes locked on the spot where my father and Diana were seated. I felt the blood in my body rush faster, every cell warning me that something had just veered off course. I knew that look, that expression. It wasn't a toast, it wasn't a cheerful anecdote, it was confrontation. Ethan took a slow breath and began, his voice calm, yet every word was sharp with intention. I wasn't planning to speak today. Truly. I believed what needed to be said had already been said, in the way we looked at each other, in the vows we exchanged. But some things, if left unsaid, become a silence that poisons. And I don't want to start our marriage with that silence. Now every eye in the room was on him. The air grew heavy, drawn in by the weight of his next words. I don't love Clara because she's perfect, not because she's easy to please, easy to predict, or easy to accept. I love Clara because she's real, because she's still herself after years of enduring doubtful looks, quiet judgments, and dinners where silence hurt more than any spoken insult. My heart clenched. I wasn't sure I was breathing. Ethan wasn't saying this to flatter me. He was bearing witness. I've watched her walk into rooms where people pretended not to see her, and smile anyway. I've watched her show kindness to those who never earned it. I've watched her wrap up her past in silence, just so she could live her present more fully. His gaze shifted then, directly to my father. It didn't waver. And today, I didn't do her a favor by showing up. I didn't marry her out of mercy. I'm here because it's the wisest decision I've ever made, to marry someone who knows how to love, even when she hasn't been properly loved. No one moved, no one clapped, no one whispered. A new silence, thicker, deeper, settled over the room like the first snowfall of winter. I turned to my father. He sat motionless. The wine glass in his hand paused mid-air. His eyes stayed on Ethan, but the sharpness was gone. They were just empty, as if for the first time he realized what he had lost. Diana sat upright, hands folded in her lap, but her jaw had tightened. The untouched white wine in front of her remained still, and for the first time in my life, she no longer looked in control. Ethan lowered the microphone and looked for me. I sat frozen, my heart bursting though no tears fell. He returned to his seat and placed his hand gently over mine. No pressure, just presence. I looked at him. I didn't smile, didn't speak. I simply nodded. Thank you. Thank you for saying what I had clenched in my heart for years. Thank you for not letting me sit there once again, pretending not to hear the sneers behind my back. Thank you for calling me by name, with love, with truth, with an unwavering presence that couldn't be erased. I glanced back at the head table. Diana sat tall, scanning the room, as if searching for someone still on her side. But no one was. No one looked at her with agreement anymore. The silence in the room didn't attack her. It simply withdrew its support. My father stared down at his glass. He didn't lift it, didn't sip. He wasn't angry. He didn't object. He just disappeared, like always. But this time, I didn't feel pain, just sadness. Sadness for a father who had a daughter and never realized she was a gem. Sadness for a man who chose silence so long it severed the very blood that tied us. The party continued after that, but everything had changed. Friends came to hug me. Former teachers touched my shoulder and said I was braver than they ever imagined. And when an old friend whispered, "I always thought you were strong, but today, you're more than that. You're real." I smiled, not the practiced kind, a real one. Grateful, because for the first time, I felt seen, loved without needing to prove I was worthy of it, and when the MC asked softly, "Would anyone else like to say a few words?" I saw Diana shift slightly. She placed her hand on her chair as if preparing to stand. I looked at her, not with defiance, not with fear, just looked. And then, she didn't stand. She didn't speak. She simply exhaled and stayed seated. It wasn't an apology, but it was all I needed, because sometimes silence, for the first time, is finally mine. I didn't know how long I had sat there after Ethan returned to my side, his hand resting gently on mine like an unspoken vow. Outside, the wedding carried on. Glasses clinked, laughter rippled through the air, as if nothing had just been shattered by the truth. But inside me, something had broken, and something else had quietly begun. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to adjust myself to fit the mood of the room. I didn't force a smile to keep the peace, didn't lower my voice for fear of disapproving glances from the head table. I sat there, calm, steady, anchored in a strength I had never felt before. And I understood. This is what it means to stand up. Not to rise in protest, but to stand firm within yourself, unshaken by anyone's gaze. Ethan said nothing more. He simply turned to me, gave a small wink, a simple gesture, as if he had just helped me cross an invisible threshold I had feared my entire life. I pressed my lips together, nodded, not in agreement, but in affirmation to myself. I've crossed it. Soon after, the first people to approach me weren't the ones I had expected, but those I thought were only here out of politeness. An old friend of my mother's, hair silver, face worn but eyes warm, gripped my hand tightly. She didn't say a word, just held it for a long, steady beat, as if every blessing she could offer was carried through that touch. Then my old principal, the one who had handed me my graduation diploma, leaned in and whispered, "You've lived with grace, and today, you lived with truth." I didn't need to ask what they'd heard. I didn't need to explain anything. I knew. It was clear. The truth didn't need to be emphasized. It only needed to be lived. I stepped away from the table, not to hide, but to be present. I walked past Diana's seat. She was speaking with someone, but I could tell. Her gaze no longer commanded the room. Her face was still composed, elegant in that familiar icy way, but the sharp confidence was gone. I passed her without pausing, without dodging. For the first time, I was the one choosing not to stop for her. My father remained seated, alone, staring blankly into the space beyond the wedding flowers. His wineglass was still full. No one toasted with him. No one reached out. And maybe, for the first time, he understood what it meant to sit at the edge of a world he once believed he was at the center of. I didn't feel angry at him. I had moved past that. I wasn't sad anymore either. I just felt light, as if the weight named being accepted that I had carried for more than a decade had finally slipped from my shoulders, without anyone needing to unfasten it for me. Ethan found me at the edge of the garden, where strands of warm lights swayed in the breeze like flickering memories. He brought 2 glasses of soda, handing one to me as if this were just a quiet picnic, not a wedding that had just been torn open by truth. I smiled softly, accepted the glass, and my fingers brushed his. No words were needed. Some connections don't require speaking. He sat beside me, our shoulders touching, and simply said, "You don't have to hold yourself together anymore." I turned to him. In his eyes was the gentleness of a man who didn't try to rescue, just chose to stay. I whispered back, my voice barely breath. "I know. I don't need to anymore." I used to think love meant being lifted, being shielded from hurt. But today, I realized, real love isn't about someone doing it for you. It's about them helping you see that you were capable all along. Ethan didn't protect me from my family. He simply stood up when I hadn't yet found the strength to. And because of that, I finally stepped out of the silent role I had played for so long. The wedding didn't end with a grand speech. There was no dramatic farewell. It ended with a soft melody, genuine embraces, and one last look between me and the man who used to be my father. A look where, for the first time, I wasn't seeking approval, and he didn't offer anything. We drove back to the hotel. The city lights were glowing now, quiet like the final scenes of a film. I sat in the passenger seat, barefoot, wedding dress folded in my lap, my head gently resting against the window. Ethan's hand remained steady on the wheel, his other hand resting on my thigh, a quiet anchor for all the days ahead. Before we got out of the car, he looked at me, with an uncommon seriousness in his eyes. "I didn't stand up to protect you, Clara. I stood up to remind everyone that you're worthy." I turned to him. I didn't reply. But inside, something warm and powerful swelled, something I couldn't name. Because I knew now with absolute clarity, I had stood up. Not because someone pulled me up, but because for the first time, I finally saw who I really was. No longer hiding behind anyone's eyes. No one stood up after Ethan. No one raised their glass. No one broke the silence that had fallen over the reception hall like a dark silk drape, heavy and unyielding. I remained seated, fingers gently clutching the edge of my gown, eyes fixed on him, the man who had turned a microphone into a quiet, razor-sharp weapon. It didn't wound anyone directly, but it left unmistakable cracks across relationships that had never been whole to begin with. Ethan didn't speak for long, but every word he uttered struck like a chisel against the thick stone wall I had built around myself over the years. And for the first time, it cracked. Not into pieces, but in a way that released something, like light slipping through a door finally left ajar. No one in the room could look away from him, and perhaps many of them wished they hadn't heard what they did, but they had, too clearly to ignore, so clearly they couldn't pretend nothing had happened. My father sat motionless. His lips were sealed tight, as if they had never spoken the cruel laughter I'd heard just earlier. I saw something in his eyes, not remorse, but awareness. A recognition that came too late. Something inside him had collapsed, and no one rushed to put it back together. Diana remained composed, her posture impeccable, but her eyes no longer scanned the room with control. Instead, they flickered from face to face, as if counting who still stood with her and who had quietly crossed over. She said nothing, showed no reaction. But I knew. Her silence wasn't agreement. It was defeat. I glanced around. My friends leaned ever so slightly toward me. A few gave small, slow nods, not to congratulate, but as if to say, "We see you, we're with you." Their silence didn't frighten me. It was the rare kind of silence that didn't come with denial. I exhaled, slowly, deeply. I felt myself getting lighter, as if the thing I'd been gripping so tightly, my family's fragile approval, the polished mask I had maintained by swallowing tears, had finally slipped from my hands and vanished. I hadn't pushed it away. I'd simply stopped holding on. Ethan returned, quietly took his seat beside me, eyes not seeking validation or praise. He simply reached for my hand, gentle as an unwritten melody. He knew I was trembling, even if I appeared completely composed on the outside. I looked at him, a long, steady gaze, not to say thank you, not out of love, but to remember, to carve into my heart that once, in a room full of silence, someone had spoken for me, not out of pity, but out of reverence. I turned my gaze back to the head table. Diana lifted her glass of white wine to her lips, but paused halfway. Then she set it down, slowly, softly, as if afraid the glass might shatter from a stronger touch. I didn't think she was angry. She was calculating, weighing whether to respond or continue holding her silence. In the end, she did nothing, and for the first time ever, her silence gave me peace. The party carried on after that. People still ate, still toasted, still took photos, but the atmosphere had changed. The forced laughter was gone. So were the hidden looks behind wine glasses. Something had dissolved in the air, that invisible power Diana and my father once held simply by not speaking. Ethan's words had broken it, gently, but completely. A college friend came over and hugged me tightly. "Clara, today you weren't just the most beautiful bride, you were the most real person in the room." I smiled, not out of habit, but from the heart. An older woman who had once known my mother leaned in and said softly, "You did something today that most people never find the courage to do in their entire lives." I took her hand, and in that touch, I felt the weight of generations of women who had swallowed tears just to keep the peace. Today, I didn't swallow mine, and perhaps what I remember most about the rest of the evening wasn't the music that played or the toasts that were made, but Ethan's eyes watching me as I danced with my friends. They didn't hold pride or triumph. They held understanding. The look of a man who knew. I was no longer someone who needed to be protected. I had heard the truth. And I didn't run. I stayed. I held my head high, and for the first time in my life, I saw myself stand up. The next morning, I woke up in a small hotel room, sunlight filtering through sheer white curtains, casting pale patches of light on the floor like diluted milk. Ethan was still asleep beside me, breathing evenly, one hand resting gently on the blanket, the other still holding mine, as if he had never let go all night. I didn't feel drained. I didn't feel wounded. I just felt light. Felt as if someone had pulled out all the venomous whispers, the scrutinizing glances, and the crushing expectations that had weighed on me for years, drawn them out of my blood overnight. No scars left behind, just a quiet emptiness, like skin after rain. I got out of bed, barefoot on the cool floor. I looked at myself in the mirror, not to fix my hair, not to check for lipstick stains, but simply to see myself, like meeting someone for the very first time. It was still my face, but no longer the version shaped to fit inside other people's molds. No longer a face that second-guessed every expression, every word, afraid of judgment or misinterpretation. That face, this morning, was a declaration. After the wedding, I didn't receive a single message from my father. No calls, no apologies. Diana remained silent, too. No gift sent, no parting blessing. But the most surprising part was that I didn't feel disappointed. I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel the need. The space in my heart that had once been a bottomless pit, yearning for their approval, was no longer a pit. It had become solid ground, steady, peaceful, strong enough for me to walk on without needing anyone to lead me across. We returned to our little house on the outskirts of Seattle after a short lakeside getaway. A house with wooden stairs that creaked under each step, a large window that looked out over the backyard, and a kitchen that was always messy because neither of us was very good at cooking. But every part of it was real. Nothing was for display. Nothing was staged to prove anything. It simply was. I began writing again. Not polished drafts for magazines, but journals. Notes, messy little paragraphs full of honesty. I wrote as a way to name the feelings that had never been given space before, feelings buried beneath years of trying to be acceptable in someone else's eyes. I reread the vows I had written for my wedding day and taped them inside the kitchen cabinet. Every morning, as I reached for a mug to make coffee, one of those sentences would greet me. A quiet reminder. Not about my love for Ethan, but about the promise I made to myself. To never shrink again, just to fit into someone else's frame. One Friday afternoon, as I was folding blankets on the balcony, Ethan came over with 2 glasses of iced tea. He sat down beside me, feet propped on the wooden bench, squinting at the sunset falling over the neighbor's rooftop. "Do you think I went too far that day?" I asked. Not out of doubt, but curiosity, wondering what he thought in the aftermath of the storm. Ethan didn't answer right away. He sipped his tea, then said slowly, "I don't think I stood up to do something grand. I just didn't want to stay silent, because sometimes saying the right thing at the right moment is the key that unlocks a door someone has been trapped behind for years." I turned to look at him, and I saw something in his eyes that had never changed. He never tried to turn me into someone else. He just wanted me to be fully myself. That night, I received a message from Lily, Diana's daughter. Just one line. "I'm sorry for my mother and for everything." I didn't reply right away. I wasn't sure what prompted her to send it. Maybe shame. Maybe, for the first time, she realized that her silence had played a part in the pain I carried. But I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel resentful. Just still. Like the surface of a lake after a long storm. I replied the next day. "Thank you. He helped me find my voice. But since that day, I've known I can speak for myself. I don't know who I've become, but I know I'm not who I used to be. I no longer wait for someone to turn around. I no longer cling to the hope that one day my father will finally realize and remember the little girl who once waited for him at the dinner table. I've stopped counting the moments he missed his chances to know me, And I've stopped blaming Diana for every sweet-toned, knife-edged word. I've stopped waiting, and I've started choosing. I chose to stand, to face myself fully. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. There was no grand announcement, no social media post calling attention, no one there to witness a life-changing moment. Just a quiet Tuesday morning. I woke up earlier than usual, folded the blanket, poured myself a glass of water, and instead of checking my phone like I always did, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the sunlight quietly spread across the leaves outside. Everything after the wedding passed gently. No one said anything else. No apologies were made. No one reached out. And I no longer needed them to. I spent the first week after our honeymoon arranging flowers. Not for photos, not to decorate the house, just to arrange, as a way to steady my breath. I picked small stems, placed them into an old ceramic vase I found at a countryside market, and felt an unfamiliar peace in my chest. These small things, the ones I used to overlook while chasing approval from people who never really gave me space to be myself, now felt like everything. Turns out, I never needed to go anywhere at all. It all began with wanting to be seen, but it ended with seeing myself. I returned to writing. Not to meet editorial standards. Not to please anyone. I wrote about silence. About dinner tables with no conversation. About a girl who once thought love was something you had to fit into, like a dress sewn for someone else's shape, and how one day that girl grew up and realized real love doesn't ask you to change your form to earn it. The first piece I submitted after the wedding was published on a small site that specializes in personal memoirs. There was no payment. But the piece received over 300 comments. Women from all over wrote about the times they sat quietly, swallowing their tears at someone else's wedding. Times they smiled at the very people who had crushed their spirit. Times they stayed silent out of fear of disrupting what the world called family. One woman wrote, "I've never stood up for myself, but after reading your story, I think maybe it's not too late." I cried. Not loudly, just a single tear, slowly rolling down, but deep enough to wash away a layer of old dust. Diana never reached out. Neither did my father. I don't know what they thought, and I don't need to anymore. Everything I once needed to hear from them, Ethan had already said, more clearly, more truthfully, and most importantly, at the right time. And sometimes, the right time is what makes something feel like a miracle. Ethan and I live in a small house on the side of a hill. We bake on weekends, watch documentaries late at night. One evening, he joked, "We don't live in a fairy tale, but I think it's the closest thing. If fairy tales had fights over overly salted salad." I laughed. That's what I love about him, his simplicity, steady enough to be a place I can return to. One night, while I was cleaning the kitchen, Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind, rested his chin gently on my shoulder, and whispered, "I haven't forgotten that day." I didn't need to ask which day. We both knew. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to hold that memory like a shield. I just turned around, hugged him back, and said, "Me too." But now I don't remember it because it hurt. I remember it because it helped me see who I really am. And that was the greatest lesson of all. That love isn't about someone else declaring you worthy. Love is when you can confidently say, "I am worthy," whether anyone sees it or not. If you're still reading this, if you've ever sat quietly in a cramped room full of family who never really listened, if you've ever waited endlessly for a validation that never came, if you've ever shrunk yourself just to fit into someone else's world, then I hope you understand this. You don't have to wait for someone to grab the mic for you. You can stand up. You can speak. And even if the room doesn't listen, the most important thing is that you heard yourself. The final whisper isn't for anyone else. It's for me. I once waited to be loved. Now I choose to love myself, fully, quietly, and without needing an audience.